Well, one thing I was going to say, and you alluded to it beforehand, is you're actually a second-generation writer, and that both of your parents were journalists. And what I would like to know is, you know, did you resist that at every stage growing up, following in the footsteps, or was it something you always knew you wanted to do, and how did that go?
No, I bought into it 100%. I had my first newspaper story published in the Mobile Register when I was 12.
Wow.
Right.
Now, where did they work, your folks?
My father worked for the Mississippi Press. He was the editor there. And my mother was a stringer for a number of daily newspapers. The Hattiesburg American, Mobile Register, Clarion Ledger.
Back in the old days, newspapers used to have stringers in every little town. If any news would happen, that you'd get hired and be paid $30 or something to go do a story, right?
Right. So I had this wonderfully, macabre Southern childhood. My mother had polio, and it was hard for her to get around. So I was provided a Polaroid land camera. And when I was 12, I started, she'd drive me as far as she could drive, and I'd hop out of the car and go and photograph wrecks and drownings and all this really kind of terrible stuff. But when you get in that kind of family where, dinner's on the table, but a news story breaks and food and dishes are swept away and typewriters go out on the table, and then especially, if you realize you have a little bit of power to make the lives of elected officials incredibly uncomfortable.
That's good.
But I think that, I knew I would write fiction, I think, because I always loved it better. I was a better feature writer than a spot news reporter. I never really had the killer, that killer go for the throat. It just never felt good to me. And I like to write the stories where I got to really use language. But the day I kind of knew I would have to write was my neighbor called and wanted Mama to send one of the kids down to her house to get some vegetables from her freezer. She was putting up new vegetables and stuff, and so she wanted to be sure all the old stuff went out. And her husband had been our shortstop on our neighborhood baseball team, but he had developed diabetes and so had lost his legs and stuff. And Mary was not well herself. So Mama sends me down there to get the vegetables with a little, paper grocery sack. And I'm going down the road, and I stop, and Miss Hattie and Miss Maddie, the two spinster sisters, were out on their porch dipping Garrett snuff. So I had to stop and talk to them for a little while, and then I had to stop at the pond and check on the tadpoles. And I finally get down to the house where I'm headed, and the lady of the house had taken ill and did not feel well, and she said, just go to the freezer and get some vegetables. Just go on back there and do it yourself. And I go back there and open the freezer, and there are Earl's legs and saran wrap.
Why are you attracted to horror?
And it's like, I am such a good girl.
You just reached around
I
Earl's
did.
legs?
I just good look.
Did you push one aside?
Oh! And I get home, and my mother, I'm horrified, and I said, Mama, why would she have his legs in the freezer? And Mama said, well, why don't you ask her?
That's a journalist, right?
Right.
Yeah.
She said,
no other mother would say go ask, right?
That's the thing to do. And I did, and she said that when he died, she wanted to have him all together so that when he got to heaven, he could walk. She didn't want him to be buried without his legs. And she had stolen them from the hospital.
That's a great line for the opening of a story.
And so, I
have to go steal my husband's legs back from the hospital. I'll be back.
I couldn't fight that childhood.
No.
Oh, I'm going to ask you a question.
There is no fighting a childhood like that, Carol. You had no choice.
All right. You've talked about growing up in Monroeville and the impact that To Kill a Mockingbird had on you. Did you ever sneak into Harper Lee's yard and try to figure out what she was up to?
Well, like I said, I didn't live there. We only went back there to visit. And no, you didn't bother her. She was known already when I was 5 years old as somebody who did not want to be bothered. And I think Heather alluded to an essay I wrote called Looking for Harper Lee. For years when I was a journalist, everybody knew I was from that town. So my job was to get the Harper Lee interview that she had never given to anybody. And I tried lots and lots of different ways. And my favorite way was a letter that I wrote to her that she took the trouble to mail back to me with the words "hell no" scrawled across the top. You know, I saved it because like it's almost an autograph. You know, I could sell this on eBay. There was no eBay in those days, but finally, I decided to start refusing those requests because I guess I learned enough about her life to understand that she was not Scout. She was Boo Radley. And she wanted to be inside. She wanted to be hidden. And the minute her cover was blown by that book becoming a huge bestseller and her face becoming familiar, she felt like it ruined her life. You know, and it's only lately in the last few years when she's come out of her house at all to receive any kind of award. She came last Friday to the award banquet in Monroeville where they gave the Harper Lee Award to Fannie Flagg. And it was the first time she'd ever come. And she said, well, do I get one too? And they gave her one, by God. But I think for me, the real influence beyond a book that I love and go back to every year or so is I lived in a town where the most famous person in town was a writer.
That's amazing.
And so it existed as a possibility for me, whereas a lot of kids, I guess, it would never have occurred to them that you could become a writer, you know. And something about seeing how she transformed that little town into this magical book that I was reading made me want to learn to do that. You know, I just wanted to follow in her footsteps. And so I published this essay about never meeting her and all this, and all her friends said she hated it. I heard this back. And then finally I was down there visiting Miss Wandy, and we went to the Catfish Cabin on Friday for lunch, and there they were, Nell and her sister, Miss Alice. And they said, come sit with us. So I got to go sit with them for about an hour. We never mentioned the book. We never mentioned my book. She knew who I was. I knew who she was. At the end of it, I was so happy I didn't bother her. I was happy to leave her alone. I think she really earned her anonymity. And I really, understand it. Also, if her first book had only sold 3,000 copies, she'd be out here hustling it just like we are. Let's be honest. I would like for you to describe your first experience with publication. What it did for you, what it didn't do for you, what it did to you. Was it the answer to your prayers? Was it the beginning of your nightmare?
I think I'll talk about Summer of the Redeemers. It's the first novel that I published, and it is... It had a very strange impact on me because I became like wanting to hide under the bed. I really did. And not because there was anything wrong in the book or anything that I was ashamed of, but it just seemed as if I was completely naked and that all of these characters and places and people that were mine.
Private.
Right, and they were very, very private, and I had this intimate relationship with them, and I had spent so much time alone with them, and now other people were meeting them and reacting to them, and it was almost more than I could bear. But I will tell you the foolishness of a first-time writer is I got over that. I got over that, and I would saddle up my horse and go riding in the woods, counting my money.
I love that.
It's just, we'd gallop through the woods and I'd be stacking up those columns of gold, figuring how much money I was going to make. What a fool. But, it was great because I didn't write the book for money, but once it was sold, I thought surely there'll be some financial reward for this. No.
Not so much.
Not so much. But nonetheless, I got to tell a story and people read it. That was an amazing thing to me. Just the very idea that anything I had to say would be of value to anyone at all is still astounding to me.
I was going to say, I don't know if y'all have heard Pat Conroy's story about his first publication, but he wrote The Water is Wide, which was then made into the film called Conrack. But anyway, back in the day, he had written this novel, and he sent it in to the publisher, and Jonathan Galassi called him from the publisher and said, Pat, we're very excited. We're going to publish your book, and mentioned the figure $5,000. And Pat said, John, I am so thrilled, but I don't think I can afford that. And they said, no, Pat, we're going to pay you. And that is a true story. He hasn't had that problem since.
I think that Southern writers have a really unique relationship with place, that it is a big part of our writing. And I know that for a time you were snatched up and dragged off by your family and didn't live in the South. Do you think that has broadened you as a writer or reader, or how do you think that's impacted your approach to writing about the South or not?
That's a good question. Thanks. My dad worked for Ralston Purina as a salesman. He sold cattle feed and pig feed and all that to farmers. So we moved to all the garden spots in the Midwest, Dayton, Ohio, Muncie, Indiana, and Champaign, Illinois, and we moved every 2 years. And we talk like this. Come on, you guys, let's go down and get a pot. Come on. I talk just like this, little boy from Indiana. And then we'd come down and spend a summer at my grandmother's, where all my little couldn't talk like this, and I had to learn to talk like that too. So in the fall, I'd talk like this in school, and then I'd start talking like that when I was in the summer. And I swear, I think that's where this thing with my ear and the dialects, because I didn't want to be made fun of in either place. And trust me, if I talked the wrong way in either place, But even more of an impact was I grew up in Indiana where there was no racial problems because there were no black people. And then in Alabama, we were surrounded by black people, and of course, everything that was happening on the news was very, unsettling to me. And I had a formative experience when I was 7 years old that inspired Crazy in Alabama. We used to hang out at the swimming pool in town, and up the hill was the Dairy Dog, which is like the Dairy Queen, but not a real franchise. And they had two windows, white and colored. Well, I was a little Yankee boy, and I'd never seen two windows before. And I went to the colored window because there was nobody waiting in line. And everybody laughed at me and made fun of me, and my cousins laughed at me and called me, imagine what they called me, you know what they called me. And I steamed about that all day at the swimming pool, and I remember thinking very clearly, it's the same ice cream. It doesn't matter which window. Why would they serve it from two different? I just couldn't wrap my head around it. My parents were an anomaly because they weren't racist, and I had never been exposed to that. And I just remember the humiliation of being laughed at. And I thought, someday when I grow up, I'm going to try to understand this. And I've now spent 7 novels trying to understand it. I don't think I'm quite there yet. But I think having that little bit of outsider in me, I was from Alabama, and we carried it with us like a virus wherever we went. I mean, my daddy used to, wherever we went, he would immediately go find the African-American side of town because that's where he could find the food that he would eat. Collards and grits and all those things, they were only sold in the black supermarkets, and that's where Daddy went to shop. And so somehow being a little bit outside the culture, coming back in, and what I wanted to do in Crazy in Alabama, I mean, there were 2 pictures of the South being shown on TV at the same time. People with fire hoses, blasting little black children in the park in Birmingham, and the Beverly Hillbillies and Green Acres. So we were either, ridiculous buffoons or, murderous racists. And it didn't have any relationship to my family, the people that I knew, and all the things. It just seemed so mysterious to me. I guess that's how a career gets born. It's just a question that I was asking, and I'm still asking. Like, how did that happen? It's up to you. Do you ever find that you feel like you have a responsibility to live a life that's interesting enough to be turned into fiction? Like, do you do stuff just so you can put it in a book?
You gotta meet my friends.
You're just taking down what they say?
I don't need anything other than those crazy people. And yeah, we have a good time. I think that's the thing from growing up in a really small town where there was nothing to do but read or get in trouble. And so, we had mischief, and as I said, my mother had polio. And so when she had us kids, it was like the first time she had a chance at childhood because she spent 9 years in the Warm Springs Foundation for polio victims. So she had us, and she was just determined. I mean, we did crazy things like water bomb the police department. My mother drove the truck. Every year we stole our Christmas tree. It was like the annual Christmas tree thing to do. And we'd drive around and scout around for the perfect tree.
Out of somebody's yard?
Out of yards, out of cemeteries. The very best one, though, Mama couldn't find anybody who had a truck, so she borrowed the hearse from the funeral home. And we cut the tree off Main Street in Lucedale and dragged it into the hearse and drove it home. And my mother was such an arch criminal. She was like, cut the stump again so they can't match it.
It's the only Christmas tree that made a trip in a hearse that day, Pam. God, I could see the cop, right? That's hilarious.
It was that kind of wonderful small town safety and the way the town would put up with eccentrics, because we were the eccentrics in the town. And my dad was a Yankee. He was from New York. And when I was little, I'd heard my mother, call him a damn Yankee. And so he was swinging me, and he had something to do, so he stopped the swing and made me get out. He's afraid I'd fall off and kill myself. And I stomped my foot at him and put my hands on my hips and looked at him and said, "You're nothing but a damn Yankee."
How'd that go over?
He leaned down and kissed me on the cheek, and he said, "Yes, and you are half Yankee."
I want to ask you two questions as one. What is the best piece of advice that you ever received about writing? And what's the worst piece of advice you ever received about writing?
I think the worst piece of advice was a college professor who told me that it was a ridiculous dream and not to pursue it, that no one ever got published. I mean, and he had not read anything I'd written, but it was just in general that it was an impossibility. And so that was the worst. And the best piece of advice I ever got was from another writer who said, if you can walk away from writing, walk away now. And if you can't, then accept what your life will be. And I think that really took me back and made me think at that particular moment, do I really want to spend the majority of my time alone, making things up, being cranky, and spending this much time in my own head? And if I did, would I give it 100% and put my whole heart into it and not do it like when I felt like it? And that was really, I think, when I answered those questions, that was when I knew that I would be a writer, whether I ever published or not, that I would always write. And so I might not be a published author, but I would be a writer forever. I'm going to ask you the same question.
I thought it was such a good question, I didn't even come up with an answer.
Oh.
Dang. I can tell a story about when I asked somebody else that question.
Okay.
Y'all know the book The Lovely Bones, Alice Sebold? Well, I taught her at Squaw Valley before she was ever published, and she brought the first chapter of that book to Squaw Valley. And I read it, and I thought it was brilliant. Never even realized I'd had her in class, and then a few years later it was published, and it became like the world's best-selling book of all time. So she came back to Squaw Valley, and she was on stage, and I asked her, what's the best and the worst advice you ever got about writing, Alice? And she said, they actually both happened on the same day here, and you gave me one of them. And I went, oh, God, did I give her the worst advice she ever got? She said, no, the worst advice was from an agent who had read the first chapter of Lovely Bones and said, it's terrible. Who wants to read a book from the point of view of a dead girl? give it up and write something a little more fun. And then later that day, Alice had me for a one-on-one conference, and I told her that agent was crazy, and she should keep going. It's one of the best things I'd read. She said, I took your advice and followed it. So later that evening, we were standing around at the cocktail party, and this good friend of mine who's a literary agent came bouncing up, and she said, okay, Alice, you got to tell us, who was it? Who was the agent? And Alice looked at her and said, it was you. So I learned, never ask that question if you're sure the answer is not you. Think how much money she lost for that one little chapter she didn't like. The best advice I ever got, though, I got to say, Melanie Griffith, when I went to work on the movies, I said, you've grown up in this. Her first movie, she was 14. And her mother, of course, is Tippi Hedren, so she's a second-generation movie star. I said, what advice do you have for me? I'm just starting out. She said, never work for free. They will beg you. They will tell you it's just this one time you're going to do. Never do it, because they'll never stop asking. And I don't know how many times I've thought of Melanie since then when somebody says, can you do just one draft, just one little quick draft outside the contract? You know? So that was good. And the worst advice was a teacher I had at school who said, write what you know. You know, if I wrote what I know, I would have written 7 novels about being the depressed son of a Ralston Purina cattle feed dealer. You know? No, write what you want to read is the advice. Write the kind of book that you want to read. And that when people are starting out and they say, what should I write? I say, what do you love to read? If you love to read, you know, high-grade softcore porno, I think that's where you're going as a writer. If you love to read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you might be working on a magic realist novel. But it's got to be, as Carolyn said, something that gets you interested enough to spend 3 years of your life sitting in a room thinking about it. And if you think about it, there's not that many topics that you want to spend 3 years thinking about. Right?
Really? Do we need...
More? You want to do one more question?
Sure.
Or do we want to let the audience...
Let's take some questions.
Yeah.
Or did we just talk your ears out? Yes.
Question I've been wondering for a while. Why did it change to Bewitched from Beverly Hillbillies?
Oh, the question is about the movie of Crazy in Alabama. Why did we use Bewitched instead of the Beverly Hillbillies? Well, myself and Antonio Banderas went to meet Paul Henning, who was the creator of Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, several other television, Petticoat Junction, in his vast mansion in Beverly Hills. We showed him the script, we told him what we were trying to do, and he said, you will not sully my great creation with your tawdry little movie. So, Columbia Pictures owned the rights to Bewitched. So we didn't have to pay anybody for anything. We said, thank you. End of that story. But I actually loved the Beverly Hillbillies, and I loved as I said, that was what we were seeing on TV about the South at the time, and I liked the play of real life against the false life and all that. But the movie business is one great big suck hole full of compromises, And at the end of it, the studio gave us $18 million to make our little art movie because they wanted Antonio to sign a contract to make Zorro 2. And that is exactly why there's a movie of Crazy in Alabama today. And I'm just delighted he wanted to do my little book.
Wow.
Who's got more questions?
How do you write so well from a woman's perspective being a man?
Well, and I would have to ask that about Carolyn, because she's written a lot from a male point of view as well. I think that writing is all about being able to just sympathetically project yourself into somebody else's skin. And, I was raised by Southern women. All the remarkable people in my life were Southern women. The men were off getting drunk or losing their job or something, and the women were holding it all together. 3 generations in one house, And there's something really, for me, very special about the way women think. It's strange. I don't get it. Y'all go in circles, we're in straight lines. It's not Mars and Venus. It's like Mars and 1943. It's like 2 things that aren't even in the same universe. But we were talking earlier, and one of the reasons I like to write fiction is I get to be that person for a few years. I got to be Elvis for 3 years. And seriously, when I'm writing that scene of him going on the Ed Sullivan Show, it was felt just like being on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was really exciting, you know. And you have to be as hooked up in your own brain as we are to get off on something like that, you know. But I don't know, it's pretty cool.
Talk about writing from a man's point of view.
Well, I think with any character, you have to give them a part of yourself. And I will say that I try to be careful when I write male characters to only put them in a situation where I feel fairly certain that I can manage that terrain accurately with reality. But of course, you know, the characters are my creation, and I've never murdered anybody, but I sure have killed a lot of people. So.
Yes, ma'am.
You have somewhat crazy people writing you, and in there, yes, of course it's her. Writing down these lines that you've written so beautifully. Some are so funny, some are so sad and so touching. And I know I want to do it, but I haven't done it, just to tell you how much we think you are so quotable. Just amazing.
Well, thank you very much. And no, please do send them to me. And I'll go, I wrote that? No, what I get are the crazy people who quote Bible verses and tell me I'm going to burn in hell. Those are some of the things that I get. But I do get a lot of very nice letters. And then there are the people who want to kill me because Sarah Booth is broken up with Coleman. The Coleman support group is strong and violent.
The question is, would we talk about our writing routine? Well, I'd like to say that I sit down crisply and type out about a chapter and then, you know, drive off in my gold-plated Mercedes, but it's really not like that at all. I get up in the morning and I do the internet until I'm just too ashamed to do it anymore. And I've said every clever thing I ever could think of on Facebook, and I quoted Ogden Nash, and people are like, get on with your life, Mark. And then I sit down and I write maybe a sentence, and I get up and go check the mail, or, you know, go to the grocery store, and then I come back, and if I have any drugs, I take those. Usually I'm out, though, because I'm a writer. And what I try to do is I make myself available to the typewriter. I still call it a typewriter, even though I've been writing on a computer for 23 years, for 8 hours a day. Because Barry Hannah, my old teacher, said you should spend at least as much time doing what you do as a plumber does. So spend 8 hours. And I'm not sitting there typing for 8 hours, but I'm not doing anything else for those 8 hours. I'm not on the internet. I'm not listening to music. I'm not watching TV. I am occasionally gardening, because that actually goes really well with writing. You can do a little, it's probably like taking care of critters. You can do a little bit and go back in and go do a little bit more, and it's a nice break, you know. But basically write until what I'm writing just sounds ridiculous to me, and then I stop for the day.
I try to write every day, and I'm like a seasonal person, and my favorite routine is to get up early in the morning and write while I'm fresh, and then attend to the day's chores, you know, and then write more if I can and feel up to it. But in the summer, because I have livestock, that is a reversed day, because you want to get up and go outside and do your chores outdoors.
Before it's too hot.
Yeah, before it gets too hot and too terribly creepy, awful, miserable. So I do write every day, but I'm like, I think better if I'm moving. Somebody told me that I could actually call this a form of meditation, that you don't have to sit and meditate, you can do movement meditation. So cleaning stalls and brushing horses and exercising horses. And,
Pulling weeds.
Yep,
Yeah.
chasing dogs and that kind of stuff. It allows, it sort of frees my subconscious. And I gotta say, my subconscious does a whole lot of work. It is really it's a lot harder working than I am, than my conscious state. So that's what I do. And I do work every day, holidays without exception. I brought work here that I will read through and make edits on, since I didn't bring a computer. But if you lose that connection with what you're writing, it's really hard to go back. It's like you get scared of it. It's like I'll never be able to get back to that place in the story that I was. So it's just easier to work every day, as boring as that is.
Here's another little trick for anybody that's trying to be a writer. Stop when you're right in the middle of something interesting.
Right.
And then the next day when you come back, you know right where to start. A lot of times you're tempted to go ahead and write the rest of the scene because you know it, but then you don't know where to go next. So if you stop in the middle of something, and then it goes right back in. But these are things we like to talk about instead of writing. It's lots of fun.
Well, we gave you a break from that then. You got
Yeah.
Yeah, you did.
writing,
Thank
so
you for that.
We're glad you came.
Thank y'all so much.
You're writing not a book, you're writing one page. Every day when you sit down, you're going to write a scene. So if you start thinking of writing a book, you'll never do it. It's too big. You can break it into little pieces. Today I'm going to write a scene about a judge walking up and sitting down at the bench.
Oh my God.
That's all I'm going to do.